Belgium did so later. The Netherlands did so in 1584. Hungary in 1587. Denmark and Protestant Germany in 1707. Great Britain and its colonies in 1752. That means here also in Canada and of course it was not the United States at that time. It was under British rule. So Canada and the US and so on implemented it the same time as Great Britain in 1752. In Sweden in 1753, in Japan in 1873, and that is when Japan was becoming westernized. In Egypt in 1875, in Albania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Turkey, all between 1912 and 1917, and in the Soviet Union in 1919, in Greece in 1928, and in China after the Communist Revolution in 1949. So almost all countries of the world accepted and implemented the Gregorian calendar by that time. So from 1582 to 1949, countries were accepting the Gregorian calendar. It was not accepted all at once. So, as you heard, when it was first implemented by Pope Gregory, October, there were 10 days that were dropped from October. Just to make this correction, 10 days from October were dropped. So the calendar that we have today is not, you may think that it has been, like this forever. It has always been smooth, there has never been any problems with it and so on. But if you go back to that time, 1582, in October, what happened? 10 days are missing from October. And when, when Great Britain and its colonies accepted the calendar in 1752, 11 days were dropped from September of that year, because by that time the inaccuracy was now 11 days, and so they had to drop 11 days from September. And so this is how they manipulated the calendar. And when the calendar was implemented in various countries, there were lots of disruptions at that time. Riots and so on took place. People objected to it because, to have the calendar disrupts your entire life. If you have just imagine if you were to have that kind of a change today, what would happen in the world, right? The disruption of the lives of people. They don't know when their payday will be. They don't know when their birthdays will be. Right? Should we celebrate the birthday according to the old calendar or the new calendar? Should we have our payday according to the old calendar or according to the new calendar, and so on? And all sorts of disruptions, all sorts of plans or whatever they had and so on, according to the calendar, everything now disrupted. So throughout many of these countries there were riots. But the only reason for this change in calendar was the fact that the seasons were not right. The religious celebration, and especially the celebration of Easter, was not in the correct season anymore, just because of that. Now, the Julian calendar, there are perhaps still some Christians today who follow that. And they do not accept the Gregorian calendar, and the reason for that is because, this was the year, this was the time in which, or the calendar that was being implemented at the time in which their Lord was born, Isa alayhi salam, their Lord. Right? When their Lord was born, it was the Julian calendar, and therefore the Julian calendar is the correct calendar, and that should be followed, not anything new. So up to today, there are Christians who do not accept the Gregorian calendar, and they follow the Julian calendar. So when they have their Christmas, it's a different time, the celebration of the so-called birth of Isa alayhi salam and so on. They celebrated according to that old calendar. Going back a little further than that, the Julian calendar, of course, was implemented by Julius Caesar at a time before Christianity. This was in the pagan days of Rome, of the Romans, when they were pagans, right? It was done because the calendar that they were following before that, the old Roman calendar, they wanted to make changes in that. It was not accurate in the first place, and there were lots of corruptions in it. Lots of corruptions had taken place in that old calendar. And so Julius Caesar decided to implement a new calendar, which was called the Julian calendar, maybe 30-something or 40-something years before Isa alayhi salam. So now, that old calendar, the old Roman calendar, there were only 10 months in it, not 12. It had 10 months in it, and it began in spring, in March. And the winter time, or the winter days, were not fixed in the calendar. That was outside of the calendar. So the calendar ended before winter started, and then restarted again at the end of winter, at the time of spring. And had 10 months alone. And they used to call these months by numbers. There were numbers. But maybe from the time of Julius Caesar, or perhaps even before that, and later on other Roman emperors and so on, they changed the names of the months. When you compare that to the Islamic calendar, the names of the months have never been changed. Just as they were from the very beginning, they continue to be used. Dhul Hijjah, Muharram, and so on, all of these months, the names have never been changed. The Arabs never changed that. All they did was to just say that we have Muharram 1 and Muharram 2, just as we have Rabi al-Awwal and Rabi al-Thani and so on. We will have Muharram 1, Muharram 2, instead of having Safar and so on. That's all that they did, but the months, the names basically remain the same. So when you look at the names of the months that we have today in English, you will see the remnants of that period of Jahiliyyah, old Roman calendar. September, Septem is 7. October, Octo is 8. Novem is 9, and Decem is 10. And this, just like the Urdu, Sad, right? Septem, Sad, Octo, At, Novem, and now, right? And December, Das, right? These were the last 10 months of the year. And this is because Latin and Sanskrit, they are very closely related. They are, Aryan languages. These are the Aryan languages, Latin and Sanskrit and so on. So they have a lot of similarities in them. So there were only 10 months. And then, and this is how they named them also, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, up to 10. Then they began to change. And Julius Caesar, where did July come from? Because he wanted to put his name there. July, it became July. And where did August come from? Augustus Caesar, another Caesar, right? Another emperor of Rome. Augustus. So he put his name there for the other months, so July and August. And the other names, most of them are the names of the gods and goddesses that they worshipped. January, February, March, April, and so on. All of these are names of gods and goddesses worshipped by the Romans. January is, and I'll just speak about this one and end here. January comes from Janus. Janus was for the Romans the god of gates and doors. The god of gates and doors. when they added these 2 months, January and February, this now covered the winter months. So now the winter months are included, and they have names, right? January and February. They were put at the end of the calendar, after December. So the year actually for them originally, when those 2 months came into being, ended in February. Not in not in December, in February. And the new year started in March, right? This is how the old Roman calendar was. Until Pope Gregory, he's the one who decided to put January as the first month of the year. So all of these changes they did. And why did he do that? Because January, although, Pope, he's a Pope, he's supposed to be not accepting any of the pagan gods of Rome. January, being the named after the god of gates and doors, they thought that this should be the first of the beginning of the calendar, the beginning of the year, gates and doors. And in the beginning of January, the Romans used to do a lot of celebration for this god. January, Janus, they used to celebrate, have big, big parties and all of that. Rum drinking and so on. Rum, I mean alcohol and parties, dancing and all sorts of things, right? From the night before that going into the new month, into January. And this is something that has continued among Western countries up to today. And this is why they have their New Year's celebrations. The Old Year's night, the last night of the year now, that is December the 31st, they have all of the big parties and drinking of rum and dancing and all sorts of things, and the celebration of the coming of the new year, January, because this is taken from the pagan Romans who used to celebrate their god named Janus, the god of gates and doors. So this is the thing. This is the calendar that everybody is following today. Compare that with the purity of the Islamic calendar. I had talked about this in past years, and maybe and stopped talking about it for many years, but decided maybe this is information that everybody needs to know. So I'll stop here, and if there are any questions, just a few questions, and then we can go. Now.
Sheikh, you said in the time of Umar, they did not have the year. They used to...
The number of the year, yeah.
Why? They did not have they did not have the Roman year?
They were not following that. They were following their own year, right? And of course, in many other parts of the world, there were different calendars. Up to today, the Chinese have their own calendar, although they are also following the Western calendar in order to do business with the rest of the world, right? Everybody else is following the Western calendar or the Gregorian calendar, just because you need to establish a common time that is accepted by everyone. So just for what is the term to use? For maybe like commercial and other social purposes and so on. Islamically, nothing wrong with using another calendar for that, to establish common dates and so on, right? Islamically, unfortunately, what has happened is that we have slowly began to drop the Islamic calendar. Now that we are using the Gregorian calendar, we have gradually dropped the Islamic calendar. And the only reason that we are using the Islamic calendar or the Hijri calendar today is for religious purposes. When it's Ashura, when is the beginning of Ramadan, when is the end of Ramadan, the Eids and so on, right? That is the only reason that we are using it. And if not for these things that are there fixed in our calendar, we would have perhaps dropped the Islamic calendar completely. But these are the things that are preserving it. But we should know our calendar much more, and we should in fact be using that more than we use the Western calendar. But because we see a problem in the Islamic calendar, when is the start of the months and so on, this moon fighting that goes on and so on, right? Because of that, many of us have drifted away even further from the Islamic calendar. But the only thing that is preventing the Islamic calendar from being implemented in a proper way, I would say, is a single Islamic leadership, which we don't have. The Khalifa, when the Khilafah came to an end, this is what disrupted a lot of things in the Islamic world, in the Muslim world, including the calendar. And the problem became heightened as the years went by. So the only thing I think that will restore the calendar, the Islamic calendar, to its proper usage and so on, is when we have a unified Islamic leadership. Then, everybody will be following one calendar. Otherwise, maybe the fighting will